Steel has a genuinely good reputation in cycling, and it's an earned one. A well-built steel frame rides smoothly, lasts for decades, and can be repaired almost anywhere in the world with a welder instead of a factory recall program. That reputation is also exactly what gets used to sell a very different category of bike: heavy, low-end steel frames marketed on the romance of the material rather than the quality of anything actually built around it. These are 10 patterns of steel bike regret that buyers report most often. And in almost none of these cases is steel itself really the problem. It's what a rock-bottom price point does to everything else on the bike: the wheels, the drivetrain, the fork, and sometimes the tubing gauge itself, long before the material choice ever really comes into it. It's worth saying clearly at the outset that steel, done properly, is genuinely one of the best riding frame materials that exists, which is precisely why it's such an effective word to put on a box, regardless of what's actually inside it. 10. The big box mountain bike with a full steel frame paired with a Shimano tourney or equivalent entry-level drivetrain. These bikes are built to hit a specific shelf price at a department store, and the steel in that frame isn't chosen for ride quality or tube shaping. It's chosen because it's the cheapest way to weld a bike-shaped object together at scale. Riders who buy one expecting the smooth ride quality they've read about in steel road bike reviews are usually just carrying several extra pounds of dead weight for no benefit whatsoever, since the tube profile on these frames is picked for manufacturing cost, not for the flex characteristics that give good steel its reputation in the first place. These bikes are also disproportionately common as a first bike bought after a long gap from cycling, which means the rider least equipped to notice the difference is often the one buying it. It's worth pointing out early that none of this is really about any specific named brand. Most of these patterns show up under dozens of different labels, frequently coming out of the exact same handful of contract factories regardless of what name ends up on the down tube. The brand on the sticker is rarely the useful signal here, the actual build spec underneath it is. 9. The fixed gear or single-speed steel bike bought largely for its look. It typically comes with cheap, heavy-gauge tubing with none of the deliberate tube shaping and butting that makes a genuinely good steel frame ride the way steel is known for, attached to a drivetrain with no gears to make an actual hill bearable. Owners frequently report the bike sitting unused within a year of purchase, once the aesthetic appeal runs headfirst into the reality of riding it anywhere that isn't flat, and resale on these tends to be poor as well, since the same aesthetic-driven buyers are usually looking for something newer rather than a used one. 8. The vintage-look commuter bike sold with a rear rack and fenders already welded or permanently bolted onto a frame that was never actually engineered to carry touring-level loads. The overall look is what sells the bike in the listing photo. The tubing underneath is frequently the exact same generic steel used across a dozen different rebadged models coming out of the same overseas contract factory, dressed up with different paint and a slightly different saddle to look like a boutique product rather than a mass-produced one. 7. The steel gravel bike bought purely as a budget alternative to aluminum or carbon, without accounting for the real weight difference on a long ride. This isn't a knock on steel gravel bikes broadly. Some of the most respected frames in the entire gravel category are steel, built properly, with carefully chosen tube profiles that keep total weight reasonable while preserving the ride quality steel is actually known for. It's that a buyer comparing options purely on price tag often ends up with the heaviest bike in the entire group ride, sometimes several pounds heavier than a comparable aluminum frame at the same price point, and doesn't understand why until the first genuinely long climb of the day, at which point the extra weight is felt on every single pedal stroke rather than just once at the moment of purchase. 6. The second-hand steel frame bought mainly for its patina, without anyone actually inspecting it for rust first. Steel's one real structural weakness is corrosion working from the inside out, usually starting at the tube seams and around the brazons where moisture naturally collects and sits. A frame that photographs beautifully can be quietly rusting from the inside for years. And by the time corrosion becomes visible on the outside, the tubing underneath has often already been structurally compromised, sometimes to the point where a frame that looks like a straightforward repaint job is actually unsafe to ride at all. A quick, low-tech way to check for this before buying secondhand is simply tapping the tubing near the bottom bracket and seams with a coin and listening. A solid tube rings with a clear, consistent tone. A tube that's thinned from internal rust tends to sound noticeably duller or flatter at the exact spot where the corrosion has progressed furthest, and that difference is usually audible even to someone with no mechanical background at all. No tools required beyond a coin and a quiet room. 5. The touring-marketed steel bike bought by a rider who is, realistically, never going to tour. The frame is deliberately built heavy and stable to carry fully loaded panniers across weeks of riding. Ridden unloaded around a city on a daily commute, that exact same design just feels sluggish and overbuilt, and the buyer ends up owning a bike optimized for a use case they were never actually going to use, when a lighter, more nimble, commuter-specific frame at a similar price point would have suited the actual riding far better. 4. The entry-level city bike built with a steel frame and steel wheel rims instead of aluminum ones. Steel rims look identical to aluminum rims in a listing photo, but they break dramatically worse in wet weather, since steel doesn't dissipate heat or grip a brake pad anywhere near as well as an aluminum sidewall does. It's one of the most common cost-cutting substitutions on budget bikes, and one of the least clearly disclosed anywhere in the spec sheet, usually buried in a parts list rather than mentioned anywhere in the marketing copy. And most new owners only discover it the first time they brake hard in the rain. 3. The single-speed or fixed-gear conversion performed on a frame that was never designed with horizontal dropouts or any kind of chain tensioner. Riders discover, usually within the first few rides, that keeping chain tension correct on a frame that wasn't built for it is a constant, genuinely frustrating maintenance chore that a properly designed frame simply wouldn't require in the first place. 2. The heavily painted, rebadged steel frame sold under a dozen different store brand names, all coming out of the same handful of overseas contract factories. The paint scheme and the decals change every single season to look like a new product. The tubing, the dropout quality, and the actual weld quality frequently don't change at all, and buyers comparing what look like completely different bikes from different brands are often, without realizing it, comparing the exact same frame twice, sometimes at noticeably different prices depending purely on which storefront happens to be selling it that particular season. 1. And the regret reported most often of all, buying a steel bike purely on the promise of ride quality, without ever checking the total weight of the complete finished build. A genuinely great steel frame can still end up in a heavy, sluggish overall bike once it's paired with heavy steel wheels, a heavy unbranded fork, and the cheapest available components, and that finished weight is almost never printed clearly anywhere on the box or the listing. It's genuinely common for a low-end steel bike, marketed on ride quality, to weigh 5 to 10 pounds more than a mid-range aluminum bike at the same price, and almost none of that extra weight is in the frame tubing doing the job steel is actually good at. It's in the cheap wheels, the heavy fork, and the low-end drivetrain hung off of it. Ask any shop mechanic which bikes get brought in most often with an owner asking why it feels so much heavier than expected, and this exact pattern is usually most of the answer. The practical version of all 10 of these, if buying any steel bike, new or second-hand, weigh the complete build before anything else, not just the frame, since a light frame can still hide inside a 28-pound finished bike. Check for rust specifically at the seams, around the bottom bracket shell, and anywhere a rack or fender is bolted on, since those are the exact spots where water sits longest. And treat rebadged, unfamiliar brand names at a suspiciously low price as a reason to look closer at the actual component spec, not the frame material printed on the sticker, since the sticker is very rarely where the corners were cut. None of these checks take more than a few minutes, and every one of them would have caught at least one of the 10 regrets on this list before money changed hands. None of this is an argument against steel as a material. Some of the most beloved, longest-lived frames in the entire history of cycling are steel, and that isn't changing anytime soon. It's an argument for actually checking what's built around the frame before buying, because steel's genuinely good reputation is precisely what makes the cheap end of this category so easy to oversell, and precisely why it's worth spending 5 extra minutes checking the whole build, not just the material stamped on the frame, before handing over any money. The riders who end up genuinely happy with a steel bike year after year are almost never the ones who bought on the word steel alone. They're the ones who check the whole build first and happen to find a good one underneath a good frame. Thanks for watching. If you want more honest looks at what's actually worth buying in this industry, hit subscribe and stick around.